The global influence of Sabbatean Frankist networks. The medieval foundation of Graz. 13th century to 1496. The origins of the Jewish population in Graz are primarily Ashkenazi, tracing back to the 13th century. As the capital of Styria, Graz hosted one of the oldest Jewish settlements in Austria. Reliable evidence dates to the last decades of the 1200s, when Jews lived mostly through moneylending to the local nobility. By 1398, a community had formed with a Jewish quarter, a synagogue, and a mikveh. These were Ashkenazi Jews, the Central and Eastern European population that had spread through German-speaking lands from the early medieval period. This foundational era ended in 1496, when Emperor Maximilian first expelled all Jews from Styria, beginning a 400-year ban on Jews that left the city officially clean of Jews. The Sabbatean eruption and global phenomenon. During this long exclusion, the Jewish world underwent what was perhaps the most significant messianic eruption in its history. The Sabbatean movement, centered on the 1666 proclamation of 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗶𝗁𝗍𝗶, a Sephardic rabbi from Smyrna, was not a fringe cult but a global phenomenon. Historians agree that a substantial portion of world Jewry accepted his claims, though estimates of the movement's reach vary widely. This movement was completely cross-class. The lower class provided the energy and public demonstrations, the middle class liquidating assets as the logistical backbone, and the elite, including renowned scholars and wealthy financiers in hubs like Livorno and Venice, became his most ardent prophets. Even after 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗶𝗁𝗍𝗶's forced conversion to Sunni Islam in 1666, his followers, known as Sabbateans, maintained secret networks across the diaspora, establishing early settlements in Palestine and the Levant through the efforts of Nathan of Gaza. Frankism and the area of operation. In the 18th century, the movement evolved into Frankism, a radical religious sect popular among the middle and upper classes in Eastern Europe. Founded by Jacob Frank, born 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗶𝗁𝗍𝗶, who claimed to be the reincarnation of 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗶𝗁𝗍𝗶, the movement focused on a quasi-Jewish, quasi-Christian, quasi-Islamic syncretism. Frankist activity was concentrated in a network of towns across the southeastern Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth, particularly in Podolia and Galicia, with hubs in Medzhybizh, Communitas and Lwów. Theologically, Frankists turned Lurianic Kabbalah on its head. They believed that because the Messiah had arrived, the traditional law was dead and replaced by the spiritual Torah. This justified strange acts and antinomianism, the deliberate breaking of moral boundaries. Frank preached that followers were obligated to descend into the abyss of impurity to rescue divine sparks, leading to scandalous practices including ritualized orgies and incestuous sex rituals. The push into the Austrian Empire and mass integration. The push toward the Austrian Empire brought these networks into the immediate vicinity of Graz. After Frank's release from his 13-year imprisonment in Częstochowa in 1772, he moved his court into Moravia and Bohemia, with Brno and Prague serving as major centers. His daughter, Eva Frank, born Rachel, was declared the Virgin and the incarnation of the Shekinah, becoming the object of a devotional subcult. In 1777, Frank took Eva to Vienna, where they were received at the royal palace. This era marked the beginning of mass assimilation. Frankist families integrated into the highest tiers of Austrian society, becoming part of the ennobled Jewish elite. Moses de Brusca, Jacob Frank's cousin, is a primary example. He took the name Franz Thomas von Schönfeld, became involved in Freemasonry, and was an initiate of 𝗖𝗆𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗏 Bavarian Illuminati. These families used conversion as a tactical mask to enter influential spaces in banking and law. While Graz maintained a formal ban, the surrounding regions were intersected by these secret networks, where the rebellious spirit of Frankism evolved into the secular Jewish Enlightenment, Haskalah, and early liberal political movements. Global networks, London, America, and Israel. By the 19th and 20th centuries, these networks expanded to the west. In London, trade connections mirrored older Sabbatean routes, while in the United States, migration from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth carried the genealogical remnants of Frankist thought. The migration to Palestine and modern Israel occurred through similar transitions. Early Sabbateans established a presence in Jerusalem and Safed, while later, 20th century pioneers from the Frankist heartlands of Podolia and Galicia brought a post-traditional outlook that influenced the creation of secular Zionism. Furthermore, the migration of the Turkish dona after 1948 added a layer of crypto-Sabbatean history to the modern state. Ultimately, these interconnected networks reveal a pattern of massed integration, where original messianic fervor transformed into international financial networks, secular intellectualism, and political structures that remain interconnected across continents. The return to Graz. The collapse of the ban on Jews and the Frankist nexus. The return of a Jewish population to Graz in the 19th century did not occur in a vacuum, but was the direct result of the legal and social shifts catalyzed by the aforementioned networks. The 400-year ban on Jews was effectively dismantled by the Edict of Tolerance 1782 and the later revolutionary fervor of 1848, movements heavily influenced by the secularized, Enlightenment-driven wings of the Sabbatean Frankist diaspora. As Jacob Frank's court moved from Brno to Vienna, the surrounding Austrian provinces, including Styria, became geographic bridge points for Frankist massed families. These families, having achieved ennoblement or high financial status in Vienna through figures like Franz Thomas von Schönfeld, began to reinvest in provincial capitals. When the ban was officially lifted, the new Jewish community in Graz was not a restoration of the medieval Ashkenazi traditionalists, but was largely composed of families arriving from Hungary, Bohemia, and the Galician heartlands, the very area of operation where Frankism had been most potent. Unlike the pre-1496 community focused on local moneylending, this new 19th century population was defined by its integration into the liberal professions, banking, and industry. The ideological infrastructure of the Graz community reflected the post-traditional outlook characteristic of the Frankist transition into the Jewish Enlightenment, prioritizing secular education and political liberalism over strict rabbinical law. Furthermore, the geographic positioning of Graz served as a logistical waypoint for the Mediterranean and Ottoman trade routes that had long been utilized by the Dona and Sephardic Sabbatean merchants. The transit of goods and ideas between the port of Trieste and the administrative center of Vienna passed directly through Styria. This created a silent overlap where the secret networks of the Frankist elite in Vienna and the crypto-Sabbatean commercial interests of the south intersected. By the time Graz regained its Jewish quarter in the late 1800s, the community was deeply embedded in an international financial and intellectual web that stretched from the Levant to the American East Coast. In conclusion, the modern history of Graz is inseparable from the transformation of Sabbatean messianism into secular global influence. The city's transition from being officially cleansed of Jews to a hub of modern industrial and intellectual life was facilitated by the migration of families who had survived the abyss of the 18th century schisms. The rebellious, antinomian spirit of Frankism provided the template for the rapid assimilation and disproportionate cultural influence seen in the Graz community leading up to the 20th century, effectively looping the medieval Ashkenazi foundation back into a globalized, post-Frankist reality. The historical narrative of the Frankist mass integration within the Austrian Empire has been cited by some researchers as a potential socio-political backdrop for the genealogical mystery surrounding Adolf Hitler's ancestry. Dr. Leonard Sachs, MD, Ph.D., has revisited the Frankenberger hypothesis originally proposed by Hans Frank, arguing that primary sources and historical context support the presence of a Jewish population in Graz during the 1830s despite the formal ban on Jews. Sachs's research posits that the 19-year-old Leopold Frankenberger, identified as the son of a Jewish family for whom Maria Anna Schicklgruber worked as a cook, may have been the biological paternal grandfather of Hitler. This alleged connection suggests that the very networks of mass assimilation and secret residency described in the Frankist expansion might have intersected with the local history of Graz even during its era of official exclusion. If the Frankenberger family was indeed residing in Graz under specific legal exemptions or as part of a nascent commercial elite, the subsequent efforts by the National Socialist regime to declare regions clean of Jews take on a complex, recursive irony. This theory positions the origins of the Third Reich's leader not in opposition to, but as a direct, albeit hidden, product of the complex Jewish-Austrian social intersections that defined the 19th century Styrian capital. Sachs's argument is contested rather than settled. Critics point to the absence of a Frankenberger family in examined Graz civil records, while proponents note that families residing under conditions of formal exclusion had strong reasons to avoid documentation. This pattern was not without precedent. The broader history of Crypto-Judaism, from the Iberian Marranos who maintained Jewish practice behind a Christian facade, to Sabbateans, Frankists, and the dona who practiced Islam publicly while preserving Sabbatean ritual privately, demonstrates that formal exclusion and official absence from records did not preclude actual presence. The archival gaps inherent to that historical context mean the hypothesis cannot be definitively confirmed or dismissed. The theological roots of Sabbatean Frankist antinomianism cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the Canaanite substrate from which Israelite religion itself emerged. Modern biblical archaeology, particularly the work of Finkelstein and 𝗏𝗏, has established that ancient Israelite religion developed from within Canaanite culture rather than in opposition to it, and that pre-monotheistic religious practices, including ecstatic ritual, boundary transgression as sacred act, and fertility cult, persisted within Israelite communities long after the codification of the Torah. The Hebrew Bible's repeated condemnations of these practices are themselves evidence of their persistence. Within this context, Lurianic Kabbalah, the direct theological ancestor of Sabbateanism, can be read as preserving structural echoes of these older West Semitic frameworks. The cosmology of divine sparks scattered through the realm of impurity, the Sitra Achra as a necessary counterpart to holiness, and the idea that descent precedes ascent all share deep structural parallels with pre-monotheistic Levantine religious logic. Whether this represents conscious transmission or independent convergence on ancient psychological patterns remains an open scholarly question. What is clear is that Frank's doctrine of the descent into the abyss as obligatory sacred act did not emerge from nowhere. It radicalized tendencies already latent within Kabbalistic thought, which itself drew on a religious imagination shaped over millennia by the Canaanite-Israelite continuum. The Amorite contribution, historically associated with decentralized, tribal resistance to institutional authority, finds a structural parallel in the Frankist rejection of rabbinical law and preference for itinerant, network-based organization, though direct genealogical connection here is inferential rather than documented. The result is a movement that, while rooted in 18th-century Eastern European social conditions, carried theological DNA whose origins predate monotheism itself. This does not require positing unbroken secret transmission, it requires only recognizing that Kabbalistic mysticism preserved, in transformed shape, very old ways of thinking about transgression, impurity, and the sacred that originated in the Levantine world from which Judaism itself emerged. This does not complete a historical loop so much as illuminate one, suggesting that the antinomian impulse within Sabbatean Frankism drew on a religious imagination whose deepest origins lay not in 18th-century Eastern Europe, but in the ancient world that first gave rise to it.